Hello everyone, today we talk about the central and northern Italian urban institutions before the affirmation of the Commune. You know that we talked very often about the Italian communes on this channel, and yet there is historiographically always this sort of jump right away. The period is scanned is that fundamentally the communes as an institution appear in the late 11th century, even though we do know actually how things worked before there and how there was, interestingly enough, as we will see today, already quite a lot going on politically, administratively, and more. This sense is that that's still a starting point, right? And then we talk about the various phases of communal history, and we of course go always forward. This is a bit like, of course it makes sense, right? But you can still go backwards depending on what you really are interested in and the genesis of certain phenomena, the causes, and also the effects. The results as a consequence are necessary to be understood in order to explain really what this whole thing was about. So first of all, there is, for anyone interested, an Italian communes playlist. There is also one about medieval Italy in general, because we will talk here about even the Carolingian, the Ottonian eras, as you understand, not just per se, but observing how certain dynamics had started to manifest themselves from that point, right? And or even that is a limiting perspective, if you want. However, we will come back on this topic. For today, let's observe this specific aspect, right? The public and episcopal functionaries, right? We talked about cathedral chapters, their role in the general cultural, administrative, and also sort of moral development of these communities, right? Especially in the cities, and we know that this is true all over post-Carolingian Europe, but naturally Italy was more urbanized and somehow witnessing the most uniform, say, attribution of comital powers by the imperial, that is public, authority, in order to keep this going on. And the commune, as we know, forms in embryo through this these representatives, but not only, right? Because there are the assemblies, and there are also private experts. Let's say it could be all the same people, right? I mean, the groups just overlapping on them altogether, but still having different functions, because the public and episcopal functionaries were a bit truly those who worked on behalf of the imperial and episcopal, at least, authority in this broader universal frame set of the Western Empire, and not only. The assemblies, instead, were essentially the spontaneous expression of popular representation, right? And they had been there from quite a long time, and unfortunately we're not so well documented about them, but we see that they're so old and they appear so early in the sources that of course they had always been there since Roman times practically. Plus, you have these professional, the experts, certain figures worth of particular faith, trust, competence, authority that were used, especially from a juridical point of view, to fundamentally legitimize further the political and institutional action. But these were essentially private professionals, right? And they represent, in that sense, the finest of all the activities that the Italian communes, especially in the 10th, 11th century, were starting, in fact, to profile in a much more, say, advanced way that it had been witnessed in the Middle Ages up to that point. And this is what we will also come back on perhaps now in the video. So, as we've seen in the videos, we've not made too many videos about 10th century Italy. There are some good ones I made about the Ottonian period in general, all the Ottonians. We talked about, say, this broader imperial and public functions also in Carolingian Italy, but we will have to come back on such topics to be a bit more contextual, at least in function of today's video. In any case, you know that during the 11th century, so before the last decades in which the Commune properly appears, not, say, more or less everywhere in the Italic kingdom and in the Papal States, this being one of the most important characteristics of Italian development, it was not just particularly rapid and consistent, but also synchronic, right? These cities, despite essentially melting away what had been a functional national monarchy, especially from the side of the local vassals of the empire that at some point were still fighting to try to become kings themselves as Italians, were, however, maintaining first of all, the very strong sense that they were Italic subjects of the emperor. They had a specific culture and homogeneity, etc., but that in this sense were identified by specific political dynamics that were developing essentially internally to this system. This is a particularly important aspect about Italian history that gets always deeply misunderstood. Namely, Italy always makes the exception in many ways, and so people look at the Middle Ages, generally speaking, look at just how big, like in 19th century, say, terms, a single color stain is on a map, right, of whichever time, including the medieval ones, and saying, wow, you see this thing is big, or is apparently more united, or whatever. It must have been really the bigger deal there, right? Very often this is actually not the case, right? And when you look at these essentially 30 cities that would evolve later on into real states, institutionally speaking, you realize that such fragmentation actually betrays a shocking homogeneity as far as all these centers were developing like, and how they were also being represented in front of the emperor, right? We'll talk more about the Lombard League, but that is just the most obvious example of how these forces could unite, but because again it's the most, say, internationally relevant, but say historiography, even though it's dramatically advanced on these topics, remains very often too much for the academics, and pop culture goes on literally not knowing anything about Italian communal history, albeit it's basically one of the single most important pillars of Western civilization during medieval times, and deems this area to have been some sort of, since it's fragmented, it's, I don't know, not advanced or not effective or not, there's nothing is really moving to that as opposed to a big kingdom, right? This is actually quite hardly the case, not just because armies put together were actually, I think, the second largest in Europe after the Kingdom of France, and basically at the same pace, but in this regard, really carrying out some incredibly impacting dynamics that I don't think you can study basically any other country in Europe at the time, especially in the West, without knowing the consequences of, right? The entire Crusades, the entire empire, the various policies, say, of France, of other, say, of the Byzantine Empire as well, were depending substantially on the balance that, as you know, especially the Holy Roman emperors could maintain or not maintain in Italy. And the civilizational development there is shocking, and it was shocking to the same rulers who tried to essentially contain the system, but were fundamentally overrun in the process. Right, this would happen mostly later, but this had always been the case in Italian history, that all the dominations that we see succeeding themselves in the peninsula are fundamentally a sort of call, right, by the same locals to avoid an internal centralization and essentially running their own business until this was not infringed, in fact, by a too oppressive government. And for the rest, they were also, again, quite aware of not just the privilege that the Italic crown had, because it was essentially the only mandatory one in order to get the imperial one in Rome, right? And so there was no way around that. Also, geographically speaking, if you wanted to be crowned emperor, you had necessarily to curb in a way or another in order to essentially gain the favor of, more realistically, of central northern Italy. But at the same time, you were depending on themselves, because this wouldn't explain why, for example, the Germans had not even established a functional national monarchy, but still from their specific ethnic duchies, the emperors were, the kings of the Romans were essentially going for the Roman journey, right, and preferring, in fact, that to centralization in Central Europe, right, and the reasons are obvious, right. Italy was not just chronically fragmented, but it was also dramatically rich, and so it constituted the best and most obvious objective for anyone trying to win an hegemony over the Mediterranean, reuniting the Eastern and Western churches as a consequence, right? Because that would have been the ultimate thing. If you sum Germany, Italy, the Papal States, and Sicily, that's it. Constantinople falls, right? And except, again, there are enormous forces in the peninsula that are really establishing, cementing themselves on the basis we will see now. So during, for example, the Patarian movement, that, as you know, was this sort of mixed, we can say from one side populistic protest, but still, of course, ridden by some, at least, of the Italian militias that were urbanizing at that point. It would be the same fathers of the Communes later, with some heterodox taste, because heresies were spreading, unfortunately, exactly in these areas, northern Italy, southern France, the Rhineland, etc. So the most advanced places in Europe, right? The whole problem was intertwining as far as, say, the continuation of the Bishop.Count policy by the Germanic emperors was infringing on the autonomies of these lay communities, right? And up to that point had been, and were still technically, developing in the shade of episcopal power, but in this sense were not liking more than much the fact that the emperors would simply appoint the next bishop, that naturally as an elected figure can pretty much be played politically with, and accusing, of course, this of being an incredibly impure practice as far as the fitness of the clergy was concerned. Think about simony, nepotism, etc. That weren't really a big deal, because still the Gregorian reforms were in theory, and the same papacy would never quite control the election of every single bishop, even in Italy, even after the concordat of Worms, right? But still, we're pushing. In fact, we're blowing on the embers of such generalized discontent occurring, because, again, these communities were ever stronger, and they could now oppose themselves to Germanic authority, while literally the country was torn apart in these fierce struggles between those that, of course, were supporting the emperor and those who were instead supporting or being supported by the papacy. We've seen this for many communes, right? As you know, I make all this series about each commune for the historical region series as far as Italy is concerned. Well, not only, there are, of course, the series about Sicily, etc. But this one is depending, right, the alignment, on the single commune, the circumstance, especially at this point, right? Because it's still a feudal world in which the commune has not yet affirmed itself. It has never meant to be doing so to secede or, ideologically counter the idea of the empire. Those were, again, perfectly traditional and Catholic and imperially, sometimes properly proud communities, to the point they were thinking to own the empire themselves, because as we will see now, of course, the communes were notoriously founded with a specifically military but also nobiliar bias, right? Not just because they were founded by the milites, but because the citizenry was free, right, legally, in the full wake of the originary Romano-Germanic tradition. Right, and this was also an enormous divide with the rest of Europe, right? Personal liberty, political autonomy, the specific dynamic wealth distribution, and I think would keep on increasing in the communal era, as we know. And Milan at this point was already essentially the most important commune in Italy, was developing fast. It would reach in the 12th century the top, right, in size, as the largest center in Europe, and it was also essentially not quite the capital of the Italic kingdom historically. That was Pavia, but this was just a little bit south, right? You had other centers around, including Monza in the north, where sometimes, in fact, in all these three cities, the Italic crowning, right, would happen when the German rulers descended from the Alps, and it was just, again, the richer area, the most developed of the Po Valley, and in becoming so in Italy as a whole, right? So, needless to say, the struggles during the Pateria revolved mostly around the control of Lombardy and specifically Milan, right? And at this point, quite active were those sworn associations in Milan, right, that were actively participating in the political and, in fact, also military struggle, given that these were represented by citizens that went at war, and were freemen because they were armed, right? And as you know, this era too would become essentially the center of arms and armor production in Europe for half of a millennium to come, and they were not scared to take the field against, of course, each other, the enemy forces, the emperors, and especially had a great control of the urban fabric, right? Their militias were developing also in not just in the knightly dimension that was just, again, historically dominating from the early Middle Ages, but especially within the city gates, the infantry were starting to become a real thing, right? And so the problem of representation and rights was deeply felt during a time in which basically somebody was trying to establish a sort of little monarchy within the commune, as opposed to these people maintaining power, what would become the commune. That was still a very aristocratic thing, especially at the beginning, in the consular period, that is called like this exactly because it was the milites that attained this, in fact, exquisitely, warrior upper hand right on the rest of the people, but that a lot of which still cooperated with them in the making of the commune. And these sworn associations are very interesting, not just because they were the traditional way any community organized themselves by natural law, but also the one from which the same communes would be born. So even though the commune, with especially the councils, because that's what the communal foundation gets down to conventionally in historiography when the first councils appear, right? That the commune was born, and again, you have minimal variation, if any, regarding this institution all over Italy. So that's a quite spot-on indicator, just per se, that we often, by the way, get just indirectly. We know of a consul passing some law, not really telling you, look, the commune has been founded in this year, right? They didn't proclaim that. It was just like a basic, normal way of associating oneself, and as important as it would become later on, this was still seen as, okay, well, it's the new thing now. We don't need to. We do it just for practical reasons, right? We don't need to celebrate it to surely there was some foundational moment in which, of course, that it was seen as a big deal, but we don't quite have the documentation for it most of the times. So the novelty that we appreciate in the 11th century can be understood only looking, of course, at the city institutions in the previous period, right? And such institutions consisted fundamentally in two types. From one side, in the functionaries of the official authorities of the counts and the marquises, and of the, say, quasi-official one of the bishop from the other, in organisms emanating directly by the citizenry. And this already tells you a lot, because from one side you have essentially the relic of the vassalatic rule, right? Considering that Italy never had essentially a unitary king throughout its history, from the end of the Carolingian era up to the second half of the 10th century. There were many Italian kings and even emperors, right, as they were crowned in Rome, but they remained essentially within their own provincial dimension in this or that part of Italy, and never quite managed to extend control, nor other external ones from Provence, from Burgundy, from Bavaria, etc., until the Ottonians arrived. Right, so the Saxon emperors, as we know, reactivated for good this axis between essentially Germany and the Italic crown. And from the other, you have instead what would develop as initially even an informal authority, like the fact that the bishops had taken control of certain lay aspects of the city administration. It's something that dates back to Roman times, pretty much everywhere, and this thing had been reinforced, especially in post-Carolingian times during the age of the second invasion. So you see it clearly in France, in Germany, in Italy, any post-Carolingian kingdom. Inasmuch having a functional monarchy at least failed, the most important powers were often next to the various feudal rulers that also ruled essentially from a provincial dimension, especially in a country that had always been ruled from the cities. The bishops, that of course in the Roman model, so essentially the prevalent one everywhere except Ireland that would have her own different way, was centered with the diocese within the city gates. Gates that had to keep the invaders out, but that more often were actually just an instrument of power to dominate the countryside, right? And the communes, as you know, in Italy would be the only ones that effectively succeeded in the longer term to create real states territorially. But that, of course, as far as in fact, kingdoms, say feudal countries were concerned, were controlled by either the monarchy. I mean, banally, think about Paris. I also made a video, as you know, about that. But say just participating to the feudal forces and just bringing their own militias, just being more confined there than what you see instead south of the Alps, where these cities were more, bigger, and continuously a center of administration. Right? There never been like in France, you have at the point the Merovingians, the Carolingians, essentially ruling from big rural households. Right? The cities are important, and they host the court sometimes, right? In itinerating one, but the city is not. There's not yet a capital, right? Properly meant for a long time. In Italy, the monarchy fails, like in most of these countries in these centuries, but the city emerges more rapidly as the real center of the new power, and as the one that all the various rulers, from the Romans, the Ostrogoths, the Longobards, and their successors, had been ruling from, through a steady public administration that the Carolingians, for example, were quite fascinated with, and that boosted further, at least, for making things work. Like, again, there are very interesting capitularies that just following the Frankish conquest that say explicitly to the communities, tell us how you were used to be ruled here, because we have to make things work together now, especially repairing bridges, especially the most strategic elements. But let's say they accepted as rulers that there were some customs locally, and they wanted to know exactly what they were. Right? Differently from, I don't know, a country like Saxony, where Carolingians simply arrived, began to kill, deport, whatever. Here the situation was extremely different. Right? And I've explained it also this summer in the video about the Battle of the Livenza River. We talked about it in general in those aforementioned videos on the Carolingians, and also the Longobards selling it through themselves. But it was normal, right? This was a civilized country, and just politics, society worked in a consistently different way than north of the Alps. So, from the Frankish conquest, right? The counts, the marquions, had represented within the city royal power, right? This was normal, the universalistic function of a lay representative and an ecclesiastical one. The lay really representing the imperium in a quite military dimension. These were essentially, in fact, militares themselves. They were insediated in the public buildings of the cities. Remember the palace, for example, the concept of the palace, the one that Charlemagne builds in Aachen to mirror Rome. Like, this is a completely different thing. Like, you don't have north of the Alps that, right? The idea of a palace built in stone that represents public authority, something completely remote as a concept, right? Always remember the private nature of the Carolingian public authority. So these guys settle initially in the country broadly meant, because they didn't really just sedentarize within the city gates. They take control of the castles. There is a very, of course, strategic relevance, especially in the southern frontier of the empire, that can, in fact, count on this progress infrastructure dating from Roman times, bigger stone buildings, etc., and a greater level of fortification in general. However, exactly for this reason, at least in part, this is really happening everywhere, but as you know, during the 10th and 11th century, such vassals had transformed themselves in local lords. Right, they had basically unhinged themselves from the direct dependence of not just the emperor, but of the kingdom. Right, the Italic one, as we've seen, failed essentially during the 11th century. The latest attempts, right, to create a national monarchy or to develop one were actually carried out from the northwest, right, Piedmont, Lombardy, but they were curbed by the same Ottonians, by Henry II, to put down these rebellions. And even though, again, it was difficult to control this from Germany, this axis would never be altered again, right? It would never be an Italian emperor, ruler trying to compete there with the Germanic ones. Also because of the cities taking the place of these vassals, that had, in the meanwhile, by the way, married into the local Longobards aristocracy, and had essentially lost their grip on the cities. Right, this is particularly important. It would happen for many reasons. Generally speaking, when the Carolingians conquer the new lands, they inject, as you know, a bit more of what we call feudalism, even though it was vassalatic beneficiary system in nature. I made lots of videos about post-Carolingian Europe and the seigneurial system, so we know what we're talking about. But together with that came the sense that controlling the countryside was more important than controlling the city herself, right? Because in spite of the civil development of these areas, the militaries coming from the north were, as you've seen, just quite warlike minded. They just by background were habituated to a rural dwelling, and they had also a greater scope than the city, right? Also multiple ones at a time, rather than a fixed center, whereas the bishops instead were deeply rooted in the cities. And so these vassals simply left important prerogatives of government to the same bishops. That's also how, in part, these had acquired some comital prerogatives of some sort before they would be essentially reconfirmed by the Ottonians when they descended in Italy, and they needed these bishops and the cities specifically to be on their side, even against the vassals, because as we've seen, this local nobility had turned into an Italian one, basically, and they were even going at war against the Germans at a point. So that's where all the tensions and the overlapping of, and of course the aristocracy rules pretty much everywhere. I mean, the bishops were from the same families of the vassals by a degree, etc. But in fact, the bulk of this institution revolved around those who lived in the city, and we will see now and why. When you look at some parts of Italy, such as the Veronese Mark in the northeast, part of Piedmont in the northwest, and Tuscany in the center-west, that is to say, in those areas in which the dynastic, if you want, continuity of the aristocracy of Carolingian origins was stronger, right? And the dynasties that had become seigneurial in nature managed to extend their dominion over vast territories. The marquisates, the marks, if you prefer, and the counties, they maintained or settled within the cities their own representatives. There are lots of these dynasties, including, think about the Communes, etc. Whoever had these broader marquial or comital control over these provincial areas. The reason why the dynasties were stronger in these places is that they were less developed. Yes, even Tuscany. I mean, Tuscany was still, of course, the more developed area besides Lombardy, right, in the Italic kingdom overall, right, to that degree of regional scale. But it was historically much more disorderly administered, right? It was a more fragmented area, had been a frontier one from a longer time. The Longobards had fundamentally brought it directly into the within the royal control, right? Differently from some duchies in the south and even in the east, that were more autonomous, even though still all recognizing actually the royal authority. Whereas Lombardy had always been much more compact, right? It's easier to control. It's somehow more also geographically outlined, right? You have all these various cities, important road systems that are reactivating dramatically because of the importance of Mediterranean as a hub between the Mediterranean and Central European trade. It was, of course, intensifying brutally at this point. Essentially, northern France and northern Italy are the most advanced countries at the time. Look at the Carolingian polyptychs, specialized crops, the way. Just they were different areas, like the former one more rural, the second one, in fact, more urban, and different degrees of commercialization and monetization. But, right, overall, you have a greater compactness in Lombardy proper than in Tuscany, and even in the neighboring Piedmont, right? So consider that here we are in fairly early times. These are, again, importantly developed areas, but we are in the high Middle Ages, right? A consistent part of them are still swampy. They have to be deforested. Canals do not help even, so easily compacting the entire picture necessarily, as they can be exploited militarily as lines of defense and all this stuff. And this is why the same, not just, of course, the main reason, one of the main reasons actually, but why the Italian monarchy was not affirmed, right? At best, the Italian kings could control a third of the Po Valley, let's say, just to give you an idea of the actual, basis of power on a scale. And it's obvious that in those areas were the cities also, because these were Lombardy was also the most urbanized, or the ones in which cities were more compact and in communication with one another. In these areas, instead, the vassal dynasties had managed somehow to retain that sort of feudal leadership of some sort, still using the cities for government, but not making them so central, right? So there were many patrimonial strategies entailed still, the idea that the city is a bit the future, and that the fact, again, all these militas are urbanizing gradually is happening, right? There is not a rigid division between the world of the city and the one of the countryside, but it makes a difference if you're just living in a castle in the countryside, and in order to rule the city, or if you move in the city and you build a house tower in the city to rule the city from there, right? So and the surrounding countryside accordingly, right? So it's all still, by the way, very fragmented in a way. All this greater dynasties are loosely controlling these territories that, especially in the cities, are trying to autonomize themselves, and this is why they settle they either maintained or resettled or settled within the cities their own representatives. The viscounts, so those who were essentially to act on their behalf. The gastals, that were these are different names depending on, say, the terminology could vary, right? But the functions were similar. The gastals were the original public officials of Longobard kings that substituted the dukes, right? Or the counts, right? That was essentially the lay lord that, as you know, in the average Carolingian partition, say the districtuation of Europe had been ruling essentially this district that was centered on a city, on a diocese. As a consequence, before in Italy there were the duchies, and there still were dukes. But there was a hierarchy also in this. For example, the Marchians were, as essentially marcher counts, depending, however, on the counts, right, hierarchically, right? And there were many frontiers in Italy, so that was an important function as well. So these figures by themselves were destined to dynasticize themselves. I made a video about the Duchy of Spoleto, for example, that tells you throughout all this time how they was working just dynastically from the ancient district, etc. So simply transmitting their office from father to son. Especially during the second invasions, were not fully documented about every single guy ruling, even in powerful realities like Spoleto, etc. But we have an idea of the fact that, of course, the various vassals of the Carolingian Empire that is disgregating are autonomizing themselves and settling as lords, and this era is just ruling them across Europe. In some cases, these sort of B-series functionaries, dynasties, during the 11th century, even went away from the cities. Some remain, right, of these sort of delegates, right, maintaining some prerogatives, such as, for example, the right to collect some taxes, especially those relative to the food provisions, interestingly enough. This is also complex to explain. We don't have time today, but imagine these smaller, say, in front of the growing city forces, right, and especially the ones of the bishops. And the decline, generally speaking, of the rural aristocracy. There wasn't much of a need of these. Who were these guys really represented at this point, right? The vassals were decreasing in power, especially again in the most urbanized areas. So they would maintain just some prerogatives, intertwining, say, their function with one of, say, some administrative branch here of the Bishop.Count stuff, etc. So tradition never actually cuts bridges with these figures that are always useful in a way or in another, because especially these prerogatives are public in nature. So if you know how to manipulate them and how to even just to extend your control on them, you can do what essentially the communes would do with the same bishop themselves, expanding in the district, city district, on behalf of episcopal authority, even though they had hijacked it, right, later on. You have, in fact, this continuous negotiation between sub-vassals and the city institutions. Sometimes they even entered as their officials, such as judges and notaries and many other families of the city and of the territory, within the feudal clientele of the bishop at some point. So there were again different groups forming, reshaping, whatever, always maintaining that, yes, the countryside is still somehow encapsulated. It's especially in these areas, things are very dynamic. There are people who build castles with the specific purpose of selling it on the market, right? As opposed to, building a castle is a big deal because there is nothing around. These areas are very rich, very monetized, and there are guys who literally create castles but not wanting to rule from them, because there was a more lucrative business compared to it. So in the greatest part of the Po Valley cities, in which the Frankish aristocracy had basically been extinguishing, and the bishops constituted the institution of this reference to citizenship in practice, concentrating in their own hands the greater part of these civil prerogatives, the ecclesiastical system had superimposed to the comital or martial one. Again, this is crucial. Again, the power that, say, the Milanese bishops have is nothing like compared to the one that, the Florentine one has. Right? All those cities exist, but they are still under some other higher feudal power, right? And the cities are not developed all in the same way, right? And Lombardy is a hand. the others. That's why that thing actually happens. And this will be important in the later communal history, because essentially you would never have, differently from Tuscany, where popular, or even Emilia or other, in fact closer areas to Lombardy, have the people as not meant as literally the fourth estates, but I mean the citizenry broadly meant, right? And there were lots of other peoples, immigrants, working for them in the city. In a academic sense, they were still an elite. But since this development at the highest level had been scarce, the people managed to take over. In places like Milan, it's always like the bishop, the knights, and the people. It's very well balanced, because there are these great lords of some sort that always prevent the people, as it would form later, to take over, and everything looked much more aristocratic, right? And much of this is born here, because it's an older, more structured, more stratified system of the bigger city in this case, by the way. Thus, you can argue that some episcopal functionaries had taken on a sort of public value already at this point. They had, aside from the Bishop.Count thing, that is just the emperor as king of Italy and overlord reconfirming the say the comital power, let's say those powers that were already in the hands of the bishops, and saying this is like the comital ones. At least you have an authority over the district that is the comitatus, because it was, as we've seen, ruled by the counts in the Carolingian system, and you just go by that, right? Nothing really changes. There's not a fracture or a specific harsh intervention in this regard. The objective is to boost further the bishops that were already that powerful in practice. In this regard, they were operating by themselves, right? When the kings were away, or the situation was that chaotic, those were the guys who technically ruled the city, right? And there are some episcopal functionaries, such as the vicedominus in Latin, as at least it's called sometimes. Other times, by just lay cultural influence, the vice-commes, so the viscount, vice-count, deputed to the patrimonial administration of the episcopate, right? It's as if to say, again, there is, because remember always that the clergy could not comminate capital punishment. So you always needed some sort of, in fact, advocatus, right? That was a layman who bore arms and could carry that out. So that's why also those assemblies of citizens were so important for the bishop and his administration, because not just they work for him in practice, but they bypass this legal limit, right? This legal boundary for which the bishop could not act literally as a count, its prerogatives, right? And you understand that by this system, the cities already ruled themselves by themselves. The advocatus would be also in charge of the preservation and of the defense of the rights of the local church. There would be the gonfalonarius, that, as the name says, bore the gonfalon, and as such he commanded the feudal militia of the bishop. Because, of course, you, as a lay vassal, you could have the bishop as your overlord, right? And as a knight, you would essentially go at war for him, right? This is normal, right? Maybe you live in the city, maybe you live in the countryside, but you are in the district, or both, by the way, because often they had possessions in the countryside as in the city, and this would always remain the deal in communal history. You have the primicerius. This sounds very Byzantine instead, and the sort of head of the episcopal chancery. At least it's a broader Roman influence, right? Maintaining in the most sort of bureaucratic administrative dimension. There were other tax collectors, treasurers, right? So not even a few figures, such as the offices of the marquional functionaries. Also, the ones of the major episcopal ones tended to become the exclusive appanage of some families that preserved also later in time a trace of the original surname. For example, the Visconti of Milan. They obviously came from Vice-Comites, right? Vice-Counts. Even for the Visconti of Piacenza, that were another family. The Avvocati of Vercelli, so the Advocati. The interesting thing about this is that, for example, the Visconti family, that would become, as you know, one of the most powerful in late medieval Europe, was originary of just, a little insignificant signatory, right, on the shores of the Como Lake. And they emerged without too much, news about their further origins, if not their surname, that could have meant different things, by the way, because you could have different forms of sub-infeudation. At times, you actually have Viscount, this also in the rest of Europe, actually stemming from some sort of non-noble, but not even free individuals, because the counts tended, as we've seen also with the ministeriales in places like Germany, to confer the control, the defense, the administration of some of the castles where he couldn't leave with his own masnata, to guys that were not freemen. So he knew that they couldn't boast inheritance, property, dynastic rights of any sort, but that factually, because maybe the lord's family died out and these guys remained cut off, and just with this vice-comital prerogative, they would become lords, de facto freemen, and recognized even as aristocrats or noblemen later on. And this onomastic origins are fascinating. All these functionaries, together with other major vassals, and also the lesser one of the bishop, made up the so-called, at least part of the feudal Curia, that was sometimes indicated as concilium, right? So these were essentially vassals and sub-vassals that responded to an episcopal council, an organism that met periodically, and attended by the bishop, who was assisted in the most important decisions by these individuals, who were especially tasked with the mention of mediating the controversies among themselves, right? Given, by the way, that as all vassals, they had the right to be judged by their own peers, right? This was an enormous deal. As an estate, right, they were represented. Even the ministeriales, we were talking about it just the other day in Germany, they had this prerogative of, sentence, say, arbitrating, judging, etc., on the various controversies that arose from one another, right? So these vassals, here remember, are not, they're free laymen, right? But they are just bound to the bishop by this de facto private bond that, however, stems from the fact that the city is so powerful and the guy who rule from it are the bishops at this point, that they are somehow, even because sometimes the bishops do receive a comital authority, by the emperors to obey, right, in their respective functions in the offices they were covering. This is an incredibly important concept, right? Because it's from these guys that the same militas of the consular period would emerge. The public and episcopal functionaries did not govern, by the way, in total autonomy, right? It's known that throughout all the early and high Middle Ages, within the Italian cities, a population of freemen, right, of big and small landowners, provided with their own economical autonomy, and thus also able to organize themselves from a military point of view in moments of conflict, essentially in a independent way from the kingdom, were present, had maintained themselves straight from antiquity, right? We see it clearly, right? The late antique epigraphies in these Roman cities speak clearly. These guys were at the head of some large households that were rich enough, they had the clienteles that could arm them. In Longobards times, we have, say, some struggle for the throne by some pretendants, and there are the militias of these various Po Valles cities that are armed to participate into pitched battles, etc. We see it in here, right? We see the fact that you couldn't tread on them. They were just free by tradition, right? It has this spirit of liberty that had never been historically trampled from Romano-Germanic times, right? We know relatively few about the organization explicitly, again, especially from the militias, etc., but we can't easily understand that, right? And things didn't differ essentially from the general Romano-Germanic levy, except these were citizens of what would have become a commune, but again, the segmentation is the same, right? At least, actually, they could have been better equipped because they were normally richer, they had a strong esprit de corps. Again, these are all things we will see better in some video about the organization, the tactics, etc. of the Italian communes, especially. And for this reason, the, say, families of functionarial origin preferred to establish their seigneurial power starting from the countryside, right? It was easier to do so than try to, say, go past the citizenry body. In other words, even though, and I made videos about this too, this sense of freedom was pretty strong even among the peasantry in many ways, because their condition was still felt to be, yes, subjected to this or that lord, but still significantly sharing that sort of, the idea that serfdom had quite been passed, that they were Massari now, right? They had a different negotiable power. This is also an Italian prerogative. This has to do essentially with the highest per capita wealth in the world, uninterruptedly, by the way, even in the darkest of ages, right, from Roman times to the 17th century, that had facilitated actually an important autonomization of those people. But of course, the citizens were even freer than that, right? This was, again, not the case in other countries, and especially north of the Alps. But it's especially the Longobard kingdom that had conferred this sort of profile, right, and stemming from the general balances of early and high medieval Italy. And this is also the reason, so to make the long story short, these functionaries could simply increase their power in the city themselves only by having a consistent amount of land and people working on them outside the city, right? This was always the case for everybody, more or less, but as functionaries of the city, this thing this dynamic was serving them particularly well, and the system was expanding, and so more of this. And this is, by the way, the same reason why the same bishop never quite had, if not in rare cases, such as Ravenna, Aquileia, Trento, and obviously Rome, true and proper principalities within the city. Right, so that, yes, the bishop ruled, but he ruled as the leader of some broader group, right, and also a spiritual one, by the way, given that the citizens were Christians of the local diocese, of the local church, but they were also freemen in arms, which is something that is outside of the church, at least, say, ideally, right? Then, of course, the bishops had their own retinues, as we've seen, their own iron arm, of course, and some of them go at war. This is, again, notorious, but they never could, right, quite impose themselves on the citizenry to court. This is the reason why essentially the papacy wins the investiture struggle, paradoxically, in northern Italy, because, right, getting the prerogative of electing, investing the bishops, first, what this meant is that they had stripped that prerogative from the emperor, right, and these communes had been supported by the Pope against the emperor, but not, of course, to have the Pope simply substituting himself to him, also because the Pope did not really have the manpower of the emperors, right? So he knew that he was less in that regard. But that's also the reason why the bishops built some, blended estates outside the city, right, for controlling the rural population. That also have rural communes. I mean, it's not, again, that passive, especially in the High Middle Ages. Peasants were much freer, actually, than they would be in the later one, and even more in the modern age, telling the truth. And this is also notorious for any medievalist. But it makes you think, because we just mentioned the Pope as a universal power, and again, he was one of the few guys. We made the video about medieval Lazio, especially, and others about the papacy. We have seen that, yes, he established a principality over Rome, which was not the normality for bishops to do, because he was very, very important as a bishop, to say the least. The same could be said for Ravenna, for Aquileia, areas in which the church had always had a great significance. The same in Trento, that is a bit more of a feudal area, so the commune is not that so developed in the first place. But not even in these cities you have a total power of the bishop. And that's, of course, obviously the case. I made a video about the Militia Romanorum, Ravenna, Rome in Byzantine times. That tells you a bit also how the thing was working. As you know, there is a series about medieval Rome, if you're interested, that explains these things a bit in depth. Also, for example, I made a video about Rome in the time of Charles III, which illustrates the situation there at the moment of final disgregation of the Carolingian Empire, as far as the various international factions in Rome were concerned, papal power, and so on. Right. But again, the hard backbone of the citizenry here is something that you don't want to mess up with, especially in the Papal and especially in Lombardy, right? This happens, again, with different dynamics pretty much everywhere in the Italian kingdom, but as we've seen before, the dichotomy was not just about the bishop and the citizenry, but about the vassals and these other players too, right? Which is, again, particularly relevant because still there is a feudalism working around. There are essentially universal authorities that are taking an ever more defined shape, and especially passing through these, say, balance adjustments within the political institutional profile of the Italic kingdom. Right? As far as the free and militarily active city population, this had, as we've seen, been always provided with some elementary institution, right? It was necessary for them politically, militarily, and socially to be organized in their own course, in their own guild, right? For example, the evidence for non-elective assemblies are very, very old. They're essentially made up in the totality of the cases by the family leaders and or the adult males, so in substance by those that performed military service. This is something, again, we were talking about the Serbian army establishing Serbian reform establishment back in the day, say way before, two millennia before. And you have to think that literally these cities had always had some kind of organization of this form. They met on the occasion of particular events in the space facing the city church. This is also particularly relevant because, as you understand, they were pretty close mentally and physically and culturally to the same episcopal institution. And again, these are the lay organizations, aside from the feudal, the public ones. They're private ones, but they're also made up effectively by the free men in arms, right? And such assemblies, defined with the term Conventus, which means reunion, right? Or by their place, for example, again, Conventus ante ecclesiam, so the reunion in front of the church, had constituted the most immediate expression of the citizenry and therefore citizenship in its relation with the royal power. In the video I made the other day about Cremona, in the same 11th century, there is this legend in the time of Henry IV in which the emperor, who was ritually owed every year this golden globe of 3 kilos in weight from the citizenry as a tribute, fundamentally, to the supreme lay authority, was simply taken by a Cremonese knight, Zanen della Bala, which means literally in Lombard that John of the Bowl, who allegedly gave it to his fiancée, essentially as her dowry, right? And this speaks volumes. It's still the coat of arms of the city of Cremona today, and speaks volumes not just about the sense of, we are at the same level of the emperor, but also because if on the coat of arms you have literally the hand grabbing the golden globe there, you're basically saying that you want, as a knight, to take over the world through the usual struggle of, say, the doctrine of struggle and victory, of self-sacrifice in holy combat, right, as all the Indo-European mentality and beyond. And it's literally that community, that city, that sense that this body of citizens in arms is basically making a stand against any other in the world, even he who is, at least by office, owed greatest respect, but that has to earn that together with the imperium and the actual control and the obedience of the subjects that are freemen, however. So in theory, again, it's just a primus inter pares, that can claim that authority, and if he doesn't, these guys have the right to take him down. This is, again, the deepest. This is the Romano-Germanic concept of power par excellence, right? The king erected on the shields by the war band, the freemen in arms. The Longobard exercitus historically was to elect a king, and it was actually the only case of functional elective monarchy that I can think of. And these Lombards were, again, essentially the same ones of those few centuries before. So again, always think about the origins, always think about the before, because that's the only way you can explain anything. Nothing comes from nothing, really. Thus, by the way, in the Conventus, the counts had published their ordinances and have the city magistrates that helped them in their government elected, right? Imagine this taking place literally from the time of the first counts, right? And also with likely the same Longobard dukes at the end of the day, that may have been more or less connected, but also when the Franks arrived, took their place, they, as we've seen, they wanted to know how these people were habituated to rule themselves through the various offices, and so the same ones that the counts now were sitting in, and being helped by these people. I mean, how do you think, like, I don't know, in an 8th, 9th century context, like a high medieval city could be ruled? You needed the cooperation, of course, of the community, as in any circumstance, but this is how it worked. The heads of the families and some other particularly important figures, or strong or reliable one, would become the counts. Iron arm, maybe not as such, given that the count had his retinues, but they knew how to control the community, and these were influent people among them, so that's all how it functioned. Also, under the episcopal dominion that was formally elected by the people, remember that the bishop was elected by the community of the faithful, so by a part of the laymen, right? At least there was the clergy still, but it was secular power, just because it was to be out there in the world, and so it could count on a more, let's say, a stronger contact with the population, with the citizenry, and that's how the bishop would call himself the city conventus, right? In the majority of cases, to deal with particularly delicate questions that required a wide consensus. So you have the feudal Curia, then you have your internal ecclesiastical hierarchy, then you have the citizens' assemblies, right? These are all the people that make the city work before the communal era, right? Picture them, right, in terms of political power. And also very old, as generic, are the mentions of small groups of qualified individuals that were essentially consulted to solve controversies of city interest of some sort. We know relatively few about the specifics. Again, it would be very interesting to digress in the individual sources, etc. But diplomatic paleography has never been my thing. But it's beautiful, like when you actually get it and you have an idea of how they signed themselves, right? You can see the different styles of different. You could tell who was who just from seeing the signature. A notary, an average guy, etc. A clergyman, but these were experts, right? They tended to be not just average people, because more or less all, say, in medieval times, this is how communities work normally, right? When you have a written culture, it's easier, of course, to document it. And in the sources, the names are qualifying these experts altogether through generic but still meaningful terms such as Boni homines, so the good men, right? Boni in the Latin sense of, valid people. The meliores civitatis, which means the better, right, of the city, right? Those who really are, provided in this case with some sense of greater, these are the top people in some way you can rely on. The sapientes, so the learned ones, the judices, the judges, notaries, legal experts of some sort. Remember all the properties that the bishops have, that the functionaries have. These were their administrators in many ways, so they were literate. This is the most particularly important thing about Italy. It was plenty of literate laymen, differently from most of Europe, to say the least. Then you have the nobiles or nobiliores, so the nobles or the nobler ones, that instead had to do with those dynastic lineages and or some greater sense of aristocratic status, right? That in this case are all tending, albeit with different bias, let's say, to sanction the specific competence and or the prevalence, right? The character of particularly trustworthy and respected people compared to the rest of the population that would attend the Conventus, right? This is important because, as we've seen, these are outer figures. They are the citizens are free, and as such they participate to the assembly, right? Maybe not literally everybody, as we've seen, just the head families or some other freemen, but these are not yet necessarily the best ones or the experts or the guys who have the specific competence or authority to speak about certain matter. So they had to be specifically called, like if there was a legal controversy, how do we have to operate about this? Like, what do you think? Because maybe you are a legal expert. How do you deal normally with this stuff? What is your expertise? What do you say about it? And you could have the Boni homines in the 11th century next to the judges in the placeta, right? So even important juridical circumstances in which the king, for example, could be present. This was the case, right? If the a ruler was there in Milan, in Monza, in Pavia, whatever, and locally you had all these people and they had to issue an important capitulary for the entire kingdom, you needed some presence as witnesses, as this was how normally law worked, right? As a public statement legally, the witness of these people was very important, and the more important these people were, the more trustworthy, the more valid that even imperial statement could be, right? We find them in the arbitral procedures or in the vest of members of extraordinary commissions that help to counter the bishop, or also as witnesses again heard in the occasion of the assertment of particular rights. This is, again, for anybody who has studied medieval law, the standard of how communities discipline these issues on a regular basis, right? In general, such experts appear as those that, by the way, could be chosen time after time in order to represent the needs of the urban population in its relations with the magistracies that governed it. So as sort of, well, not unions, but let's say okay, there are some magistrates that have this public office. Are they doing what they should be doing? As we've seen, there were important issues: food supplies, tax collection. Like if somebody was corrupt and they infringed on their rights, etc., they would show up. And remember that a freeman has the right to bear arms. So you understand why also so violent Lombardy was at the time. Not just that, but why so many wars, so many clashes, even within the city, would occur. Because these guys would pass to the swords quite quickly if things didn't go as it pleased. In any case, the choice of the experts was preferably, or normally, right, carried out by the public functionary or by the same bishop, right? So, again, this choice had to reflect the general awareness of whom was really worth such trust and faith, because if they had been particularly biased sides, the objectivity of that action, that judgment, would have not been the validity, like the functionality, would have not been accepted, right? So that would have, it was a political problem. It would have kept creating these, right? So everything was particularly shaded, as you understand. And again, we know relatively few, but we can fundamentally still appreciate such organization for what we can reconstruct historically, and in the context that I presented you with, that, at least for anyone who is familiar with Italian communes and, or generally speaking, medieval law and institutions and politics, is also quite clear, really. Well, we will keep talking again about this stuff. There is so much going on here, because it never ends, really. I make the series because I supply a little bit more of French, German, and Italian history in the cycle to affirm certain things, right, from a continental perspective, let's say. But we will see how, for example, the investiture controversy had influenced this all, how the Edictum de Beneficis, which was, by the way, an Italic capitulary of Conrad II, the same limits of episcopal power as we've seen, the ruralization of the city public functionaries, the same great transformation of the empire throughout the centuries. These are all things that we must get contextually, because otherwise it's all pretty much null, right? I speak so much and I make so many videos because I want to provide not just with explanations, but with context for the same. Because otherwise, this is not history. Like, never be fooled into thinking that you just get the information so you know what that information is about. Information is relevant only if you have a context for it, and you know how precious it is, the broader implications of the same. I know it's painful to hear, but it's always the case. You can't simply give even a book to someone and pretending them to understand what it's written, right? Just by reading, studying, learning, understanding are all different things, right? And I try to substantiate more and more to be more, let's say, to the point, more effective, more precise, because as you have noticed, I like to explain how power really worked historically. That's the thing that to me really makes more sense in history. Like, we want to know how the thing concretely worked, not how, I don't know, let's look at the daily life of a peasant and, whatever. You can't understand that, because there is no such thing, like, even for a peasant, like a standard day. And nor you would understand the entire mechanism of medieval agriculture just by looking at this sort of film-like sort of from day to night story of the guy that gives you the thing, right? So never think that history is for everyone. History is only for those who want to understand it and who work a lot in order to do so, right? And with these elitistic notes, I stop for today. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.